My talk today has 3 sections. So I'll start by talking about the dynamics of collaboration in open source projects between individuals, companies, and communities, before moving on and talking about contribution strategies and plans. And then the last section will have some tips for sustaining those contributions over the long term. And then we'll wrap it up with links to some resources and a few final thoughts. First, I'll start by telling you just a teeny tiny bit about me. I have been in the technology industry for well over 20 years, working mostly on open source projects from within companies like Intel and Puppet. And now at VMware, as Judy mentioned, I'm responsible for our open source community strategy, and that sits within the open source program office. I'm a board member of OpenUK. I'm a governing board member and maintainer for the Linux Foundation's Chaos Metrics project. I'm co-chair of the CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group, and I also have a PhD from the University of Greenwich from here in London, where I researched how people collaborate within the Linux kernel. Now, before we dive into talking about leadership and the importance of having a solid open source strategy, let's talk just a little bit about how collaboration works in open source projects and the complex interactions that you see between individuals, companies, and communities. Now, while there are a few exceptions, contributions to most open source projects are centered around the individual. Contributions come from individuals rather than companies. And when someone submits a pull request to fix a bug, add a feature, maybe update some documentation in a project, that change comes from an individual. Commits usually include a name and an email address. But in a lot of cases, unless the person actually uses their corporate email address, you can't even tell where that person works, right? But to make this even more complicated for companies, in most open source projects, the leadership positions stay with the individual if that person changes jobs. So this means that an employee could take their leadership position in a project right with them to their next job. So companies are well served to make sure that these people are happy and well compensated and enjoying their work. Now, in most projects, there's no direct ways for companies to participate, other than dedicating time from individual employees who contribute on behalf of the company, which is becoming increasingly common. At VMware, we have people working full-time on open source projects like Spring, RabbitMQ, Kubernetes, and a bunch of others. And if you aren't sure how to contribute as a company, you might be able to hire an existing contributor, or possibly even a maintainer as an employee to do the work on the project on your behalf. And in addition to devoting time from employees to the project, companies are also in a position to help open source projects by providing additional resources. Open source projects need funding. They need in-kind sponsorships for loads of things like infrastructure and legal representation. And they also appreciate sponsorships for events or other activities. And I'll talk more about all of this as we go through the presentation. Open source communities include a wide variety of individuals who are working together within open source projects. Now this includes developers, release teams, localization and translation, marketing, community managers, tech writers, users, and lots of others who contribute to the projects in various ways. And some of these people contribute as part of their day job on behalf of their employer. Others contribute in their free time. They're all important. And all of these people are working together as one community to accomplish a common goal, to deliver on an open source project. So it's important to remember that the community or project needs have to come first. And as a company, your strategies have to take this into account. An approach that dictates a specific solution might not be accepted by a project. So your strategies need to include flexible ways of approaching resolving issues or creating new features so that you can work jointly with the community to find solutions that work well for everyone. Part of the role of an open source program office, if you happen to have one, can be to help everyone navigate balancing these individual, company, and community needs. The various groups within your organization, they really need to understand that individuals need to be able to collaborate and build consensus within the community to come up with innovative solutions for anything that your company might need. And trying to force something into an open source project can impact employee satisfaction and retention for the individuals who are contributing, since the employee can't meet the needs of the company without jeopardizing their employment. And that is just not a good situation for anyone to be in. And by taking this dynamic into account when building your open source strategies and best practices, you can help managers and leaders understand this dynamic so that your employees can meet the organization's objectives while also being good corporate citizens within the communities. All right, now that we have a better idea of how collaboration works for open source projects and companies, next up, let's talk about how to build contribution strategies and plans for participating in open source projects. Having a solid open source strategy and plans are important because successful participation in open source requires a long-term commitment. The individuals and companies that we just talked about spend months and years building trust and reputations in specific open source projects and communities. And all of that hard work is for nothing if those people keep getting pulled off of the open source projects to work on other things within the company. And in this section, I'll talk about how to build strategies and plans that support your business goals so that you can then justify this work over the long term. The most important part of building strategies and plans for your open source contributions is to align them with the overall business goals for your company. If your open source engagements don't support the overall strategies of your organization, then you'll drastically reduce the chances of being successful. By taking some time and effort to make sure that you support the overall corporate strategy, then it's going to be much easier to justify continuing these efforts during the next planning cycle for your organization. On the other hand, when your goals are not clearly aligned with the overall strategy, people will look at that open source participation as something that they can just cut or maybe starve of resources until it goes away on its own. So this will help you make the case to senior management and company executives who are not involved in the low-level details the way you are. Explaining how your open source contributions support the goals of the company can help the executive team understand the strategic importance of the work that you're doing. Now, most of our organizations use so many open source projects that it's easy to get distracted and not know where to focus. It can help to think about maybe which open source projects are strategic in some way for your company. Maybe there are projects that your operations team uses to run some critical piece of your business infrastructure. Are there any development or deployment tools that impact your ability to release the products that generate revenue for your organization? Is there other software that's important for your ability to deliver customer-facing products or services? And all of these questions will help you think about where to focus your open source efforts. And these strategic projects should get more attention than less, maybe other important projects. And these strategic projects should be a big part of building your open source strategies. So by showcasing how you use certain open source projects and how the products and services that you deliver to customers rely on these projects, you can use these strategic projects as a way to frame some of your strategies in a way that your leadership will understand how important it is that the work continue over the long term. It's also important to think about risk as part of your company and product strategies. Evaluating risk is important, right? Because your business could be disrupted in ways that impact your employees, your customers, and even the broader ecosystem as a whole. And it's also important to think about risk as being on a continuum, right? Like with most things in life, there are no sure bets, and no project or technology, open source or not, is completely without risk. There are only projects with more or less risk across a variety of categories. And you should accept that, you should think about whether to accept that business risk or not. So some projects are more risky than others, and it's going to be a business decision about risks, which risks you're willing to accept and which ones you aren't. You don't want to build a key product on top of some very risky open source technology, like building a key project on something that's maintained by a single person, for example. So it's important to think about which elements of an open source project might introduce risk and how to watch out for warning signs and then mitigate potential risks. But this is bigger than just thinking about individual projects, right? It's absolutely critical for us to be thinking about security and risk holistically across our entire supply chain, including every little package that goes into our products or our infrastructure. A potential vulnerability or a malicious attack can be in any link in the chain where it can go unnoticed unless you have processes in place to detect it as early as possible. And your company's open source strategy should incorporate some thinking about how you can detect potential issues and mitigate the risks that might be associated with them. Most of us have some combination of projects that we've open sourced within our company and other open source projects that we contribute to. And this is also a decision that benefits from a strategic approach. In some cases, it makes sense to release a brand new open source project. And other times, the best solution would be to contribute to an existing open source project in ways that would help it meet more of your needs moving forward. And there's no right or wrong answer to making this decision, but I encourage you to look hard at your company's strategies and plans for the future to make sure that whatever decision you make is aligned with what your organization is likely to need over the next few years, rather than just thinking about what's the easiest thing to do right now. As part of your open source strategies and plans, you also need to figure out how to find people who can make the contributions that you need on behalf of your company. As I mentioned earlier, companies contribute to open source projects by having employees participate and collaborate within those projects. So you need to figure out how many people you need for each project and what skills are required for those people. And in some cases, you might have employees with the skills you need who have already contributed to open source projects in the past, which makes for a really great starting point for new contributors. But the thing to keep in mind is that contributing to open source projects requires very, very different skills than participating in internal projects within your company. These people need to be comfortable in very ambiguous environments where they're going to receive feedback, possibly difficult or negative feedback, and they're going to be expected to respond to this feedback in the public in a professional manner. And keep in mind that not every engineer wants to be in that public spotlight, which can feel a bit like being under a microscope sometimes. And if you don't have the skills internally, you might be able to find some existing contributors that you can hire. But you also need to be a little bit careful about this option too, because you don't want to get a reputation within an open source project for aggressively poaching employees from other companies. So it requires a bit of nuance to sort of make it known that you're interested in hiring people to work on an open source project without really aggressively hiring them away from other companies. If you make it easy for your employees to contribute, your employees are more likely to reduce technical debt by contributing patches, bug fixes, and new features back into the upstream projects where they belong. And you should think about whether your guidelines or processes help people engage in open source in ways that work well for your organization. While you do need to provide guidance about some things like licensing, not disclosing confidential information, that sort of thing, this can be done in a more educational way. And my caution about guidelines and processes is that they can be written in ways that discourage contributions, especially when they make really heavy use of really scary legal jargon where you talk about how you're going to punish people when something goes wrong. But you're better off writing your guidelines in ways that help engineers understand what you need them to do and why, in language that they can easily understand. Now, as with any good strategies and plans, the outcome and results should be measurable so that you can tell whether your efforts were successful. Now, I love data, so it sounds weird, but measuring project success, project health is kind of a hobby for me, and it's something I'm pretty passionate about. So I tend to get a lot of questions about it, and usually the questions are focused on how to decide what to measure. And this is kind of the wrong approach, and my answer is always the same. It depends. What you measure depends on what you're trying to achieve, which is why the slide is in the strategy and planning section. So ultimately, you need to look at your strategies and plans to come up with criteria that will help you measure whether or not you're successful. So for example, if you want to improve the performance of a particular piece of software, you are Measuring things like numbers of commits is not going to tell you that, right? You need to put some plans in place to measure increases in performance along the particular thing that you wanted to improve performance in. If you want to gain influence within an open source project, maybe you look at increases in contributions or the number of employees who are moving into leadership roles or positions of influence within the project. And once you figure out the criteria, you need to make sure that you can actually get the data to measure it and start measuring it now, get a good baseline. And there are loads of tools to gather data about open source projects. Some of the commonly used tools can be found in the Linux Foundation's Chaos project. And many big projects already have dashboards using these tools or others to display contribution data for projects. I also recommend maybe over-measuring a little bit and gathering as much data as you can about participation so that if your strategy shifts in the future, you're more likely to have some data to start out with. And having some extra data can also help you investigate other ideas for how you might want to improve your contributions to the project. Now, in this last section, we'll cover just a few tips to help you sustain your contributions over the long term. Upstreaming your patches is one of the most important things you can do as you work toward taking a long-term strategic approach to your contributions. Maintaining open source patches internally is easier in the short term, right? Because you just make the patch and move on to other work. But this creates technical debt and more work for your team over the long term. This can create security vulnerabilities for your company and your customers if your employees put off this difficult work of reapplying and possibly even rewriting some of your patches if things changed in the open source project. And when you have patches that can be submitted back upstream, it gives your employees a solid starting point for contributing to an open source project, especially in the cases where you have small patches that fix bugs that maybe other people in the community would benefit from. And the project's likely to welcome those types of changes. And it gives you something that you can really use to engage in that community. And these early interactions can build and grow into long-term strategic participation in those projects and build relationships that allow you to contribute in more significant ways over time. You want to make sure that you spend time discussing proposed changes in the community before you start making them. By talking about contributions very early in the process, you can get feedback on ways to architect the changes so that they'll be consistent with the expectations of the project. You can also learn about anyone else who might be working in similar areas to avoid hopefully conflicting changes that won't work when they're merged together into the project. And these discussions also help to avoid surprising people, especially if you're working on new features or any other kind of really big change. It can also help to break those changes into several smaller, easier to digest contributions. It's a lot easier for maintainers to find time to provide feedback on smaller contributions, and it gives you time to make corrections if anything you're doing maybe isn't quite right. And this allows you to iterate on the feedback through several contributions, making sure that it's less likely to have bigger fundamental issues. And by participating in open source projects over the long term, your employees can build trust within a community and build the relationships needed to eventually move into positions of increasing responsibility. By moving into leadership positions, people gain additional insights into the future of the project and have increased influence into the direction of the project. These people are also more likely to know how to approach new features and other changes in ways that are already aligned with the direction of the project, and then can be easily merged into the open source project. And you can rely on these open source leaders to help you refine your strategies, since they will likely have ideas for what can be done within a project and how to best approach your work within that project. These leaders can also help mentor and provide guidance for other employees when you decide that you need more contributors within an open source project, which can help you build open source skills more broadly within your company. A lot of the work that we do in open source projects is based on the relationships we have with other people. My PhD research was based on collaboration within the Linux kernel. And as part of that research, I interviewed a whole bunch of kernel developers. And in all of the interviews, they talked about the importance of their relationships with other people. Almost all of them talked about how existing relationships made it easier to collaborate with others. All of the people I interviewed mentioned in-person collaboration at conferences like this one and other meetings as something that was important. People talked about how it's sometimes easier to walk through really difficult, big issues at conferences. It's easier to communicate with someone online later if you've met them before at a conference and maybe shared a meal or a drink or just had a really interesting conversation with them. Knowing the human being on the other side of the keyboard can make a bigger difference than a lot of people realize. And if your employees are working on open source projects, then you should see if there are any conferences where large numbers of other community members attend. By having some key employees attend those conferences, they can build deeper, lasting relationships with others that will benefit your company and those employees. And I've spent a lot of time at open source conferences over the years, probably more than I want to admit. And I have deep and lasting connections with some of the people that I've met at those events. And now when I need to do something new or have a question about something, I probably know someone who can point me in the right direction. And I often make introductions for other employees to some of those people when we need to learn something new or we're solving some tricky issue. You should also take maintenance expectations into account when building your open source strategies. Putting large chunks of code into an open source project, disappearing, and expecting someone else to maintain it reflects very poorly on your organization. So you need to think about how you're planning to maintain the contributions that you're making. Now, if you fix a small bug or make minor changes, somebody else is probably responsible for maintaining that. You really only need to think about this when you're making large contributions, like a new feature or, in the context of a kernel, a new driver. And you need to make sure that you have a plan for how your employees are going to maintain the code over the long term before you contribute it to the open source project. If you want to open source a project because nobody's using it, it's old, it's crusty, and you don't want to maintain it anymore, please don't do that. That shouldn't be open sourced. Dumping your project into the open source community and hoping that someone else will be just dying to take it over for you is at best a wee bit naive and generally makes your company look bad. So make sure that you're open sourcing projects for the right reasons. So for example, wanting to collaborate and innovate with other people is a good reason to open source it. If a project will need to integrate with loads of other technologies, open sourcing it can make it easier for people to help you integrate it with technologies that you might be less familiar with. And your company needs to be prepared to maintain the project over the long term, just as you would with something you released under a proprietary license. This takes time and resources, so you should take that into account when you're building your strategies. Now, before I wrap up this talk, let me leave you with a few resources you might find useful. And these slides are uploaded into Sketch, so you should have a copy of them if you want the links. But the to-do group has a whole bunch of guides that have great info about all aspects of how companies work with open source projects. The CNCF contributor strategy tag has a governance working group and a contributor growth working group, which provide templates and guidance about contributor experience, sustainability, governance, to help people develop strategies for maintaining healthy projects. And the Open Source Way guidebook has loads of details for building and maintaining open source projects. So these are all good starting places to understand best practices for open source projects. In open source projects, relationships and trust facilitate collaboration and allow your employees to more easily contribute to the projects that are important for your organization, and then move into leadership positions within those projects. These relationships and trust networks are built over time and require a long-term commitment. By thinking strategically about which projects are most important for your organization and allocating people to work on those projects over the long term, you can maximize the impact that your open source work will have for your organization. With that, thank you for coming to my talk, and I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Thanks, John. That was very insightful. I love the diagram for the Nebraska lone maintainer. I've seen it a few times in open source conferences. Are you able to share with us with VMware, like how you go about identifying that lone maintainer in terms of engaging with them? Because that's often the case for big companies, right? And it's a sensitive subject because it can be accepted or it can be rejected.
Yeah, it's actually pretty difficult sometimes to engage in some of those single maintainer projects. One of the things that we do, we try to figure out which projects are going to be strategic for us over time. And for those strategic projects, we have people who go and they do health assessments on those projects. So, are there enough contributors? Are we involved in the project? So Masai over here actually does that for our third-party projects, those health assessments. So we would catch something like that for a project that's maybe strategic for us. We also have loads of projects that we rely on that are smaller, single maintainer, and we frankly don't have a good way to figure out whether some of those projects are at risk or not. So I'm starting to look at ways that we can do that maybe for, at least for some projects that we rely on, but it's a hard problem, right? Because you look at a big complex enterprise product that probably has hundreds of open source packages within it. And then if your company, a company the size of VMware, we have loads of products, and each one of those projects has, hundreds of open source packages within it. So how do you scale those assessments and do some of that in a more automated way, I think is a problem that a lot of companies have been thinking about really since the OpenSSL Heartbleed situation where, we realize that something that all of us rely on is maintained by a couple of people part-time. So I think that those are conversations we need to continue to have, and we need to think about scalable ways to measure that. Yeah.
Hi, I'd just like, not so much a question, but just a couple of comments. First of all, I think your speech is very good. Your talk is very good.
Thanks.
I think the slide, which was towards the end, but about strategy, so no dumping in the bay, is one of the key questions. I used to work in governance within a big organization, and you have a lot of projects come towards you and say, I want to do open source, and let's go through the compliance process. Do I have to read MEs? Do I have to write license? But, everyone forgets to say, well, why are you doing this? And, just putting it out there on GitHub or whatever is the beginning of the journey, not the end. How are you going to, interact with the community, that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
so I think this is really an important question.
It's really important, and it's actually something that we've built at VMware. We've built into our compliance process. So when somebody wants to open source a new project, that's actually the first questions we ask them.
Brilliant.
We ask them questions about how they're gonna sustain it. Is it strategic? And if it looks like they're open sourcing it for, say, marketing reasons, which you occasionally get, that's a short-term win and not a long-term commitment, so those don't get open sourced. And if they're trying to dump it, those don't get open sourced
exactly.
either.
I'd also like to add on a reference to your final slide. So the OSPO Alliance, along with OW2 Eclipse, has the Good Governance Handbook. So I know a bit of blatant plugging going on here. If anyone is interested in governance and OSPOs and that kind of stuff, there's also this reference.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great point. That's a good reference as well. Thank you. Other questions? Last call? Okay, got another one in the back.
Thanks. It's a pretty niche question.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the chaos tool that you were talking about. And I see that, looking at the website, I see you've been supported by the Sloan Foundation.
Yes.
Some of my work at the Internet of Production Alliance around open hardware data standards has also been supported by them. And I was curious about what you think the motivation of a scientific research foundation like the Sloan Foundation is in supporting chaos.
Yeah.
Because funding these initiatives is always a big question.
Yeah, the Sloan Foundation, along with the Ford Foundation, do provide quite a bit of funding for the Chaos Project. So some of the people that work on it more full-time are funded out of grants. And in particular, a lot of the work on our software is funded out of grants. Because if you look at a lot of academic papers, academics who are basically writing papers and analyzing open source data, a lot of them use chaos tools. So when I was getting my PhD, I started it actually before the Chaos Project existed, but I used the tools that became the Chaos, they sort of morphed into the Chaos Project tools. But I used those to do all of my academic research during my PhD program. So a lot of academics use the Chaos tools. And in particular, both of the tools actually, Grimoire Lab and Augur, are developed by a lot of people who work at universities and are engaged in kind of the more academic side of things. So I think from a research perspective, it's a pretty good alignment with something like the Sloan Foundation.
Well, thank you for your work on it, because I'm really interested to use it.
Yeah, great. Do we have time for one more, or are we out of time, Judy?
We can do one more. If we've got the panelists for the next, so Lonica, Chris and Leanne in the room, if you mind coming over here and just getting mic'd up while we're waiting. Thank you.
Okay, there was one more question, I think, over here.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Apologies. Sorry. So I was wondering what's the I suppose thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. What's the choice process that goes on between actually choosing whether to use an open source project to whether someone tries to build internally, or do you get involved in that?
I don't typically get involved in that because I work in the open source program office, and so we're under the office of the CTO, so we're kind of a neutral body that helps and provides advice to all of the different business units. And in most cases, the business unit makes that decision based on what they believe is the best need for their product. Yep. So we will occasionally get involved if they have questions or want advice about something, but we, as an OSPO, don't typically get involved in that decision. And it's a hard decision to make, right? And I wish that individual engineers thought more about that decision, because I feel like sometimes things just get kind of incorporated in. They're like, oh, there's this library that already does this, I'm just going to grab that, without really thinking about what they're grabbing and whether or not it's going to be sustainable over the long term. So I wish more people thought about the risks and the implications of these, what seem to be sort of random decisions.
Yeah, I was sort of wondering that. Yeah. Thanks.
It's a hard problem, for sure. Okay, I think my time is up.
Perfect.
Thanks, everybody.